Fox News alert. President Biden's Afghanistan nightmare just got even worse. The Pentagon making a shocking admission today, saying that an August drone strike in Kabul killed 10 civilians, including 7 children, instead of those ISIS-K fighters.
I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, including up to 7 children, were tragically killed in that strike. Moreover, we now assess that it is unlikely that the vehicle and those who died were associated with ISIS-K or were a direct threat to U.S. forces. Our investigation now concludes that the strike was a tragic mistake.
The Pentagon revealing that information after the administration kept telling Americans things like this.
Were there others killed? Yes, there are others killed. Who they are, we don't know. We'll try to sort through all that. At this point, we think that the procedures were correctly followed, and it was a righteous strike.
What we've seen over the past week is that our over-the-horizon capacity can work and has worked in going after ISIS targets and killing people who went after our troops. So that's where our resources and our focus is going to be on at this point in time.
Greg, your reaction to the news today?
Well, I mean, unless you're a terrorist, no one wants to kill innocent people. But we need to atone for this. And the bigger question is, was this strike rushed? Was it based on limited info just to help the administration politically, right? Because, you know, he came out and he was we're going to do something. We're going to do something. And it feels kind of like it was the strike was a gesture because it was we're done here. Like after that happened, we were done. And there was a lot of rumor and a lot of pretty substantiated rumor that this was a bad thing. But, you know, they wouldn't admit it. Now they are. And I really do think he was under pressure to act. And that's why they acted, and they did a horrible, horrible thing. You know, it's been 8 or 9 months in this administration, and their mantra should be a lot went wrong because, I mean, this White House right now is a mess. This situation is terrible in Afghanistan right now. There are still people trapped there. I hope that the people are happy we got rid of a president because of his mean tweets. And in exchange, what you got is a president who's just mucking it all up. But there were people that voted a guy out because emotionally it was damaging. It was causing these sleepless nights. But he happened also to be a peacemaker, right? He didn't drone anybody, right? He didn't make the worst foreign policy decision or implementation of a decision in the last 5 decades. That's on the nice guy who lets you sleep at night. But then he does absolutely horrible things. So I'm always going to vote for the jerk because you know what? You're harder on the jerk, and the jerk ends up being more sensible because he's been a jerk for so long. He has to be, right? The nice guys get away with literally murder.
And I heard you muffling some sort of reaction when you heard them say, "Oh, over-horizon capabilities." What made you say that?
This is the Obama drone policy that's happening again. This is how you create terrorists. Shoot first, aim later doesn't work here. This is what happens. This is absolutely horrific. This is why there are so many people in the military, especially special operators, who are opposed to drone strikes in general, but specifically these kind that really miss the mark. And I'm glad you played General Milley and Jen Psaki because those two propagandists need to resign. They are doing the devil's work. They are doing so much harm to this country by trying to make this okay. They have lied to us on Afghanistan for 20 years. They thought they would continue to do so. And the fact that General Milley hasn't resigned over those 12 Marines and Navy medic who were killed, who were bombed to death. And then who did they get the intel from? That's what I want to know. Where did they get the intel? Because I think you're right. It was absolutely rushed. It was totally political. Was it from the Taliban? Mm-hmm. Because if they see a caravan of 10 civilians, including 7 kids, and they tell the U.S. military, strike this now, look what happens.
A great point.
Yeah, it was a intelligence failure, Richard, that followed a strategic failure because you back yourself into a corner surrounded by the Taliban at the airport. You have no one on the ground to call in airstrikes, and you're relying on perhaps the Taliban for intelligence.
Well, there's always been a risk when we use drones, as Kennedy's pointed out. I mean, I'm glad that the Pentagon acknowledged that this drone strike was a mistake. Sadly, there were so many more drone strikes over the past 15 or so some odd years that they haven't called mistakes. There were drone strikes in Syria. There were drone strikes in Iraq. There were drone strikes in Somalia. that happened out of the spotlight, out of the headlines. No journalists covered it. Those families are still suffering today. And they're not going to get any money. They're not going to get journalist coverage. They won't get interviews. They won't be talked about on this show or any other show. And they're suffering in silence because of bad drone policy that honestly should get bipartisan rebuke. The idea that people are being struck in the middle of the night with no, just like as Kennedy said very poignantly, shoot and then aim later. And in this case, it's very clear, and I watched the entire press conference earlier today, if they had just waited a second or 2 seconds or a minute later on this drone, they could say, oh, this is actually water and it's not an explosive. This is actually not going to the airport. They're going to drop water off to people. This could have been better handled.
Are heads going to roll because of this, Emily?
Not under this administration. I doubt it. Heads would only roll if we collectively come together in 2022 and 2024 to vote this administration out and everyone that's perpetuating it. There will only be accountability and heads rolling if the mainstream media gets its act together and presses back on this. Now, to your point earlier, the action that Americans were calling for, it was to extract Americans. It was to protect allies. It was to process Afghans in an efficient, legitimate way, not acting with, quote, reasonable certainty, as General McKenzie said earlier, which was the amine certainty that they had before this drone, the ID certainty that they had before this drone. It's like that commercial, that insurance one, where that family's paying for the house and they're like, we think we can pay. And then the comedian comes in and is like, you think you can? Would you say that, about bees? Like, oh, I think I can outrun this Doberman. I think I can outrun this bee sting. There are certain things where reasonable certainty is unacceptable, and that drone strike was one of them. General McKenzie said today that moving forward, he would have to use a heightened standard, absolutely. But to your point, that's the argument against this over-the-horizon capability that under this administration has been furthered, which is that without U.S. intel and troops on the ground, we are relying on the Taliban. We're relying on intercepted communications, video feed to get this intel at what cost? The cost of lives, and American lives at that. This administration continues to fumble everything, and I hope, to your point, heads will roll.
Yeah, we'll probably see more of these because we don't have any intelligence on the ground there, no basing, nothing.
Now, you have to wonder, how will the media cover this? Because we're always stuck with the alternate universe where Trump is president and you place every one of these actions if he were to do it. So this would have been condemned as an atrocity, and perhaps even a racist atrocity. Milley would have been on the phone with Pelosi getting ready to remove Trump from office, and there would be a groundswell of support for that. In this case, they're going to probably say, hey, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes.
In the midst of a hostage crisis, they'd probably have a countdown. Day 17.
Yeah.
Trump hostage crisis. You don't see that.
Right.